Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Gadwa Nicodemus, and I am a researcher, writer, advocate, and speaker. And I focus on this intersection of arts and culture and community and economic development. And as Matthew said, I come to this urban planning career via a career in arts and culture, choreography and arts administration. And as I was listening to this morning's presentations, I have a lot of sort of heartfelt identification with the challenges that you are all struggling with. I was running the operations and finances for a very small dance organization in New York City from about 99 to 2005. And we probably moved office spaces 3 times. We didn't have permanent rehearsal space, and the performances were sort of all over town. Movement research was what it was called. And there was a sense that, if we only had a permanent home, how much that would solve all our problems. When I moved to Minneapolis, I was working at a puppet and mask theater. People were talking about doing things piled on top of each other, and I was in the old projection booth at this old movie theater, and they'd have these matinees for kids, and I couldn't answer the phone from such and such a time because it would distract the show. And I feel like we had to be careful about flushing the toilet because it'd be too loud, things like that. But I also saw some things that were more problematic with cultural space. So when I was living in the Twin Cities, there was this big push for places to get their own facilities, to get their own home. And a lot of, the Guthrie, which is a big regional theater, got a brand new glitzy Starchitect facility. The Walker had a gorgeous new facility. And the little guys were like, us too. And some of them got their spaces. But this was not necessarily a cure-all. We had some spaces go under because, oh my gosh, it solved all our problems, but now we have new problems. We have to heat the space. That was particularly the case in the Twin Cities. And how do you handle upkeep? So those were some of the issues that I was reminded of as I was hearing your challenges, as well as the issues that individual artists deal with in terms of finding their own workspace and housing, and the tough economics of being a working artist, and especially in strong real estate market cities like Seattle. We talk about the Soho effect, and I actually push back on that narrative because I don't think that it's the case around the country. Not in every city, but there are some places where these issues of dislocation for artists and arts and cultural organizations are very much at the forefront, and it's places like Seattle, New York City, San Francisco that have these very strong real estate markets. So that's some of the climate, and then we're going to talk about this difference between space and place, and how creative placemaking can sort of be a paradigm shift and color this conversation, and cultural districts. Matthew said today's focus was on cultural districts, and I actually don't consider myself an expert on this topic. I write a lot and do a lot of research on creative placemaking more broadly, but cultural districts is one subset. So in the white paper that we authored for the Mayor's Institute on City Design, some of our case studies were cultural districts, others were not. I guess there's a Venn diagram and there's overlap, but so this is what's on the table for discussion. But I think that the undercurrent, and certainly what we heard all morning, I've heard very little about cultural districts. The conversation was, hey, we are small and mid-sized arts organizations or gallery businesses, and we need affordable and appropriate cultural space. It's tough to do this. So these solutions may go together, they may not. I'm going to offer some context, some information from sort of the national scene. I'd like to think about today as consciousness raising. I will be a provocateur. Unfortunately, I don't have all the answers, but it should be some really good food for thought to keep this conversation going. So, this issue of affordable cultural space, I think, drove drove the cultural district conversation. Oddfellows, how many times was that mentioned this morning? Who here was personally affected by the Oddfellows closing? So, that was this lightning rod and helped form this Kodak committee to look at cultural districts as one solution. And there have been some impressive progress that's been made from these recommendations. Matthew Ritker's position was created in 30 years in the making. So we have a lot to celebrate. I also think there's some good questions that can be asked about what are the most sensible ways to address these challenges of affordable and appropriate cultural space. Cultural districts may be the solution. There may be ways to rethink and retool that approach. So that's what we'll be getting into. But let's start with looking at creative placemaking a little bit more broadly. What does that mean? And I think, even though cultural districts are one subset, we said the term was thrown out all the time. So let's try to demystify creative placemaking. Well, since Ann Markuson and I co-authored the study in 2010, it has really catalyzed a ton of renewed interest and investment in this work. The ArtPlace and NEA have in combination invested over $61 million in creative placemaking all across the country, and entities like the state of Connecticut, the Kresge Foundation, and the Educational Foundation for America have followed suit by making creative placemaking a new emphasis in their grant making. And we basically applied this new term and new frame for work that had been organically happening across the countries for decades. And we painted this concept of creative placemaking with a really broad brush. So we profiled 14 case studies ranging from big cities to tiny towns. And there were examples of art and healthcare and transportation and artist housing initiatives and workforce developments. And as I said, some involved cultural district programs and some didn't. And here is the definition that Ann Markuson and I developed for creative placemaking. It's a process in which partners from the public, private, nonprofit, and community sectors strategically shape the physical and social character of a neighborhood, town, tribe, city, or region around arts and cultural activities. And our definition also speaks to outcome. I think that Randy puts this really well when he says that creative placemaking is a lot about looking at arts as the how. So creative placemaking can animate public and private space, rejuvenate structures and streetscapes, improve business vitality and public safety, and bring diverse people together to celebrate, inspire, and be inspired. So it's the how, but I don't want you to get the idea that it's all about using art and culture for instrumental benefits. It includes some of the intrinsic benefits of arts and culture. It kind of expands the definition, not just to look at economic arguments, economic impacts, which, in terms of advocacy, that's been the main, we have an economic impact. People spend money on the arts and there's a ripple effect, has been a main argument that's been advanced by Americans for the Arts. So it includes that, it includes arts for art's sake arguments, but it also expands our conception to these physical benefits and social benefits, which are sometimes more intuitive to the man on the street than, oh yes, the arts have a $1 billion economic impact. So at its core, there are these three main elements. It's place-based, it's rooted in arts and cultural activities, and it's about strategic action by cross-sector partners. And this is what I'd like to really focus on in terms of the connections to cultural districts. So this applies for all kinds of creative placemaking. I think it's really the greatest innovation of this new frame, but very much could be relevant to this cultural district conversation as well. So by emphasizing cross-sector partnerships, it forces artists and arts and cultural organizations to get out of their silos, to open their doors. And at the local level, elected officials and planners are being pushed to have new conversations and think about the role of arts and culture in community and economic development in new ways. This helps move the conversation from one about scarcity to abundance. And I think as arts and cultural leaders and artists, oftentimes we view ourselves as supplicants. Most of you articulated needs in the conversation. You know, we have a leaky roof. Yes, you do. You know, but it's also about thinking about who you could partner with and what their interests and objectives are, and identifying that sweet spot of shared value. So, you know, changing the paradigm so you're not just, please, sir, can I have some more? But these are the assets that we bring to the table. And by doing so, it can help expand new opportunities. And I think, you know, Randy was talking about just the role of the arts as the how in that waterfront redevelopment discussion, this major capital investment. And it's not just, okay, let's put some sculpture in at the end, but having arts and culture be a part of the conversation from the get-go and where that may lead in terms of opportunities. So on that note, you know, I think we got a good sense of some folks from the presentations, but how many people here represent arts and cultural organizations, say with budget sizes under $250,000? If you, okay, and what about any big guys, any like $1 million organizations in the room? Okay, and these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but if you consider yourself an artist, raise your hand. Okay, so lots of artists in the room. Who works for the city, either as an elected official or city staff? That's great. I want to hear just a few of the different departments that are represented, if you wouldn't mind shouting it out.
Planning and development.
Planning and development.
Mayor's office. Arts and culture.
Represent?
Planning.
Planning, okay. And what about folks that own property beyond their own home? Okay. And how many of you are considering or have cultural facilities or are considering including that in a development? Excellent, excellent. Any straight up, you know, developers? All right, so this creative placemaking is about cross-sector partnership, and we're on a great track, right? You're at the table, you're in conversation. So that's very exciting, and I really just encourage you to talk to people, not that you just know, but the people you don't know, and try to start identifying those potential opportunities for shared value. But let's focus on cultural districts, since that is the topic du jour, right? Let's dig a little deeper. So first of all, this seems to be a proliferating concept. Just in 2008, the National Association of State Arts Agencies put out this policy brief, and they identified 8 statewide programs to encourage cultural district establishment, certify them, and promote their benefits. And many of those programs include tax incentives. And this has only grown. I know firsthand of Kentucky and Massachusetts adding new statewide cultural district programs. There are probably others. This is actually a new global think tank initiative based out of Houston to try to come up with best practices for cultural districts. And they are looking at more of these mega cultural districts that are proliferating in Asia and the Middle East, as well as South America and Houston of all places. Or maybe, I'm sorry, I think it's Dallas. Well, you can email me and I'll tell you if you're curious. But you know, what are we really talking about here? And I think the takeaway is that we can be talking about a lot of different things. So this is sort of the granddaddy definition put out by Americans for the Arts in a 1998 a report that was just all about nuts and bolts. What is this? Why would we do it? So, a well-recognized labeled mixed-use area of a city in which a high concentration of cultural facilities serves as the anchor of attraction. All right, so there's some key words here, right? Labeled. We've got city. And we've got anchor. So to me, this is talking about a bias towards central city, towards urban. We're talking about larger flagship cultural institutions. And I know it sort of has connotations of tourism or well-heeled cultural patrons coming in. But I see cultural districts as occurring on a spectrum. And one of the popular ways to sort of envision the spectrum is this range between natural occurring cultural districts and more formal or top-down. So the term natural occurring cultural districts grew out of some great work by Mark Stern and Susan Seifert at Penn at their Social Impact of the Arts projects. And they were focused first on Philadelphia. And what they found were that concentrations of arts and cultural activity, and really broadly defined, including artists living in an area, arts and cultural nonprofits, commercial cultural firms, and cultural participation were linked to a range of positive social and community outcomes, including higher levels of civic engagement, increased population and housing values at the neighborhood level, decreased poverty rates, and that in Philadelphia it was occurring with little evidence of population displacement. And some of you may know that they actually recently expanded their research to Seattle as well as Baltimore. And many of these findings held across the three different cities, although I will say that this issue of population displacement, unfortunately in Seattle, what they experienced were that residents with lower educational attainment, that was the proxy that they used, were leaving as higher socioeconomic status individuals moved in. So again, these tensions are more difficult in strong market real estate cities where Seattle is. But because of the strong policy findings that he found for this more small scale and diverse activity, they made the argument that policy should be supporting these existing concentrations of cultural assets instead of creating new arts districts that are more top down. So that brings us to the other side of the spectrum, formal cultural districts. And specifically more top-down, anchored by major arts institutions. An iconic example of this might be Lincoln Center in New York City, which was actually created by eradicating the neighborhood where West Side Story was based in this urban renewal strategy. So I will say, though, that this does present sort of a false dichotomy. Natural cultural districts don't just occur. People and organizations are working really hard, independently and cooperative, to have them succeed, have them exist, have them form. They don't just appear. And some are formally recognized and have policy support. So for instance, this is Station North in Baltimore, which is one of Mark and Susan's case study neighborhoods. And they call it a natural occurring cultural district. However, it is also one of the state of Maryland's official arts and entertainment districts and has incentives to try to support it. So, so we can't just say either or, but I think that it helps kind of conceptualize the universe, the range of possibilities. There's a lot of variation. You can have these large institutions, small scale arts and cultural organizations, artist production-focused places. How would a cultural district be physically structured? Are we talking about linear corridors, avenues of the arts? Are we talking about a place with things scattered all over the downtown? Or is this about tightly clustering in a campus? Is that closed off? Is that open? What type of activity? Is it focused around consumption, whether that's high arts or more popular entertainment or production spaces? And I just included this slide so that you can get a sense of some of the typologies that different researchers and academics are putting out there to try to understand this universe of arts and cultural districts. There is also lots of variation in the potential management structure, financing support, and the degree of government involvement. So Brooks and Kushner, in their 2001 study of 8 cultural districts in small to mid-sized cities, they found a range from having no organized administration to having dedicated nonprofits with full-time staffs handling the management, from management being led in public sector arts councils or business improvement districts, more quasi-government institutions. And there was a range of planning and implementation. Sometimes it's just, okay, we're just going to call it a cultural district. That's it, we're done. Other times, these entities are actively seeking financing and grants and redistributing the funds to different organizations. Sometimes they're really supporting and directing all aspects of district development and activity. Financing and support, they found, ranges from everything from revenue bonds to hotel taxes to grants and donations on earned income. And in terms of government involvement, sometimes cultural districts popped up with no government support, just initiatives that were private and nonprofit led. Other times government was involved in terms of zoning or approving tax financing, ranging to using the powers of eminent domain, to capital expenditures through the general fund or special revenue bonds. And then we also see a lot of variation in the range of justifications to create cultural districts. Here are some of the often cited ones. It can be about urban revitalization, reversing blights. Or maybe you want to have a cultural district to support ancillary businesses. Maybe it's about trying to draw tourists or attract and retain residents, and that could be particularly linked to Richard Florida's creative class argument, highly educated workforces looking for amenities to try to attract people to your city and employers. It may be about efforts to promote civic pride and connect diverse cultures and have opportunities to celebrate and inspire. And this perhaps is most relevant right now for this conversation. Sometimes the motivation is mostly about increasing supports for the arts and cultural sector. There could be an increase to increase visibility and valorize arts and cultural activity in a particular neighborhood or area. It could be driven out of a desire to better meet the spatial needs of arts and cultural sector players, whether that's affordability or just needing more space, or an interest in co-locating activity because the thinking is that the sum of the whole is greater than its parts. Now, one thing I would like to point out, though, is that the argument for cultural districts to promote and preserve affordable cultural space is sort of a minority of the rationales. I think that there can be sort of an implicit justification to create cultural districts out of an interest in increasing property values and, spurring gentrification. And that's why I include this slide. This slide is actually from Minneapolis, but I love the way that every city, you have your SODO, it's no-do, and okay, we're going to create a cute 2-syllable thing that ends in do, and that's going to... So, yeah, we want condos, right? So, yeah, I think that's something that we're going to have to weigh in the balance, that cultural districts and the policy solutions, preserving and promoting affordable space, where do they go together, and where's there a potential misfit? And they come with some sticky issues too, cultural districts. Whenever you're drawing a boundary somewhere, who's in and who's out? Who are you excluding? There can be these issues of fairness and equity, and sometimes you can have the most vocal opponents to a cultural district initiative come from within the arts and cultural sector. They're just outside of the boundary. And they see, you're going to get these incentives and perks, and what about us? We want them too. what does it mean to label one neighborhood as creative or artsy, that the others are boring, right? So there are these issues. And actually, Ann Markison and I, in a journal article that we wrote for the Journal of Planning and Education Research, criticized cultural districts in terms of saying, hey, no, we think that you should promote a mosaic approach and scatter these assets and amenities across your metro. But I don't know, I go back and forth. There can be justifications for doing that in terms of equity and having more democratized access by geography, but then you also lose the ability to leverage synergies, right? That having that critical mass of activity. And just in terms of policy, if you're going to be trying to do something, it may make sense to do it in one place. So it's difficult. And there's all this variation. So it really depends how you structure the program, what your objectives are. And we have an opportunity to have that conversation and build on a lot of really good momentum and progress that's already been made here in Seattle through Kodak. So I just wanted to share the working definition for Seattle in terms of a cultural district. And it's probably, there's an opportunity for revision, but officially recognized concentrated cultural activity. We talk a little bit about the tools, and I think as I was reading the report and the recommendations in conversations with Matthew, the motivation seems to be about, okay, well, how can we bring city tools to the table to support this type of activity, this type of use in these spaces, whether that be breaking down regulatory barriers or changes in zoning or incentives for types of developers. And if we're doing this at the city level versus state, we may not be able to do some of these tax incentive programs that are happening in other programs. But what can we link together? What can we package to just try to streamline the process and bridge people with resources? So, hold this in the balance as we look at some examples. I want to share 4 specific examples of cultural district programs from different contexts so that you can get a better sense of some of the tools and benefits and challenges that people are experiencing in other parts of the country. Well, let's look at some examples and then have more discussion. So, cultural districts in practice. The first one that I'd like to talk about is Rhode Island, and specifically Providence, Rhode Island. And this was the first program, so it makes sense to talk about it. And what they actually have are 3 different kinds of incentives legislated at the state level for artists that live and work within the specified district. Any sale of work created within the district is exempt from state sales tax. Any income that they receive from the sale of work that they have created within the district is exempt from state personal income tax. And then for gallery spaces located within the boundaries of a specified district, the sale of one-of-a-kind works of art are exempt from state sales tax, whether or not they were created in the district. So now I love the idea of the legislature of Rhode Island trying to come up with a definition of one-of-a-kind original artwork and who is an artist. And yes, we have lots of fun challenges. But let me tell you a little bit of the backstory about how this policy came about, which again was the first in the country. It came about out of a local initiative in Providence, which is the capital. And Mayor Buddy Cianci, who's quite a character, he actually was federally indicted and for corruption, but he was a huge champion of arts and culture, and actually was just a big booster. And I think I'm being recorded, so don't quote me on this, but I think that he got reelected after the indictment. He was so popular. So Providence is interesting, but they wanted to make an arts and cultural district for downtown, and it was coinciding with a number of interesting interesting revitalization efforts. They actually had their urban rivers covered in concrete for decades, and they unveiled them. This was a massive federal, state, and local initiative that involved lots of collaboration. And in the 90s, they put in all of this nice streetscaping along the rivers. You know, the before and after is just amazing. But you know, people weren't necessarily really coming downtown and using it and until this water fire installation that Barnaby Evans started. He started as just a one-time installation and then was basically enlisted by civic leaders to have it be a regularly occurring event, and they built up this nonprofit around it. So they light these braziers in the city, really a number, like 14 weeks every year, I believe, on the night, and just lots and lots of people come down. So there was all this activity happening, and the Department of Arts and Culture was doing some programming in some festivals and activities in the center of town. So how can we leverage this? How can we do more? Okay, so Buddy Cianci forms this task force, and one of the people he has on board is a philanthropist, civically minded developer, Bud Chase. I'm blanking on the name right now, but I think it's Bud Chase. And what they came up with, because they had these new urbanist leanings, were okay. We're going to make this cultural district. We're bounding it by these anchor institutions, and it's really motivated out of this interest to do downtown urban revitalization. And they were able to lobby the legislature and get these tax incentives to support it. Now, what you find when you talk to people about how successful was this, and they're like, well, you know, the artists never really use those tax exemptions. The galleries do to some extent. The artists, you know, maybe they're not even claiming that on their income taxes, and to go through all the procedure of saying, okay, I want a little credit. But what it really did was it valorized them. It signified to this whole cadre of artists coming through Brown and RISD that, hey, this is a place that cares about me, that's going to support me. This is a really progressive looking city. And a lot of them put down roots and stayed and developed projects. Another problem with the downtown arts and entertainment district in terms of these incentives around artist live workspace, it wasn't really appropriate for artists to live there. The type of building stock, the economics, so they couldn't use it in some regards just because it was a mismatch of where they wanted to live or could live and work and the bounds of the program. And so they tried to correct this by designating the second cultural district, the West Side Arts District. It was an effort to get this right. And so you can see this nice gerrymandering boundary. And it's really trying to capture where the artists were living and working. And when you look at the policy rhetoric, they're saying it's about trying to make sure they can stay there permanently. When you look at the incentives, it's really restricted to those sales tax and income tax incentives that I listed. So I'm not sure how much it was able to really promote them staying there, except, again, you know, we want you here. This is an arts district. Providence cares about you. This is where you're already living. You know, stay put. But the effort to come up with these boundaries was very much driven by some dislocation of some prominent studio buildings and centered around activism from the artist community. So I just wanted to tell you that Providence has a lot of other tools that it uses to support the arts and cultural sector, but they don't necessarily match up to the spatial bounds of a cultural district. So they're oftentimes the first lender at the table when there's a new cultural facility being proposed, and that helps bring in grant funding, that helps bring in conventional bank lending because the risk is lower and just they have more confidence in the project. This is one of those projects AST20, it's a very prominent artist space in Providence. They have 3 different buildings, and it started as one sort of wink, wink, nod, nod, look the other way space and a loft, I think $800 or $500 a month, and now multi-million dollar, and all of these different institutions represented. So the city was the first lender at the table. They also do tax stabilization, so it can be a measure of planning and control. So you can get an assessment for what your taxes are going to be, the bill will be over the next 10 years, and then you can prorate it and break it up, so you're not just hit with surprises. And they play this role of providing technical assistance and being an ombudsman. So the Department of Art, Culture, and Tourism, they do a lot of meeting with people one-on-one. I want to do this. Who do I talk to? Okay, this is the language you need to use with housing and preservation and development. This is how you fill out such and such a permit. That translation role and technical assistance has been really, really important. They also developed a citywide cultural plan, which they tagged onto a branding initiative. Providence, one of its moniker is the creative capital, but instead of just sort of letting that be a nice slogan, they were able to say, let's use this as an opportunity to get a really robust cultural plan that has wide buy-in and participation. And it's not really funded, the initiatives that they laid out here, but because they have this and because it's integrated into the comprehensive planning document, they're able to be opportunistic and strategic when opportunities present themselves. So for instance, Providence was awarded a HUD Sustainable Communities grant around transit-oriented development, and they got a competitive edge because they tied a lot of work into arts and culture within the grant. So along these bus routes, these corridors, they did a series of asset mapping around cultural assets at the different nodes, and went through this visioning process to try to come up with different identities for the different areas. And interestingly enough, the third phase of this study, of this program, actually deals with zoning. So they're sort of, after all of these years, coming to where Seattle is looking right now, and they're considering doing these cultural overlay zonings in designated spots. Now, when you look at what they're trying to do with it, it's about promoting different uses and not so much about the affordability, but instead of saying, okay, we'll live work, we have to come through a variance and we have to jump through this and this and this hoop to have that happen there, or if we want to have a club with music late at night, it's saying, no, we're going to designate some portions of the city where certain things will be green lighted and encouraged and fostered. So I just think it's interesting that sort of, it's the first in the country, and now they're coming around to part of the conversation happening in Seattle right now. So I want to look now at Louisiana. And as I said, they have one of the most permissive approaches to cultural districts in the country. There are 67 districts in 40 towns and 27 parishes, which is their word for county. And in half of the city of New Orleans is a cultural district. It ranges from this tiny town. This is Grand Cane. It's a little hamlet of 200 people, and they got together and have their cultural districts and actually successfully relocated the county, the parish tourism office to their town, and have these different art events. They've only rejected 4 applications since the program was launched in 2008, and the director of the program said it was just those were really terribly written. One of them came back in, and then we let them in the next time. But if you want to have a cultural district and you speak to these criteria successfully, you're in. Now, what you get are some pretty attractive incentives. And again, these are driven by the state level, but it opens up historic preservation tax credits. And just generally speaking, if you're a property owner, For the state of Louisiana, the way these tax credits work are that you can earn 25% of qualifying expenses for rehab of a historic building as a credit on your state income tax, and that's for both residential and commercial. And this was huge because in the state of Louisiana, and this varies state by state, but it had previously been restricted to areas with designated Main Street programs. So it opened up lots and lots of properties. And what you see now is that oftentimes it's developers that are leading this drive to come together and have this coalition to do a cultural district because they want these historic preservation tax credits. And then you also have exemption from local sales tax for the sale of, or again, original one-of-a-kind works of art. And by the numbers, one of the requirements if you are a cultural district, you have to fill paperwork out every year, and they haven't kicked out anyone yet, but there are a few bad eggs that aren't very good at their paperwork, and then they'd go through sort of an intensive, 1-year process of trying to get them to do their paperwork. But they do some bean counting to try to see what the outcomes of the programs are. So you can see just the number of rehabs that happened in cultural districts since 2008, and just the 4 years of the program. The scope of using the sales tax exemption, close to 3,000 cultural events serving 3.3 million people, and the vacancy rate decreasing. And the statistic that they're most proud of are these around new businesses. There's been a net gain in new businesses, and the percentage of new businesses that are oriented around arts and culture has increased. Now, of course, some of this activity, the events, and that could have been happening whether or not you got the designation, and a lot of things are going on, so it's hard to say how much is because of this program. But they see it as a relatively low cost with some great benefits. And one of my favorite creative placemaking case studies is actually one of the districts. This is Arnoldville, Louisiana, and it's written up in the white paper. But the great things that they're doing there, I think the cultural district designation certainly helped, and they're able to point to it and say we should do such and such because it has it. But it's really a story of individual leadership. This artist, George Marks, moved back into town to care for his dying father, and just was struck by the town's decline, and then dedicated himself to transforming this little town around this indigenous arts and cultural identity. So, I think this is interesting because when you're talking about who's in and who's out, here's an example of basically anyone who wants to be in, who's willing to do this paperwork and write a halfway decent application, they're in, and they can get these incentives. But then does it have some weaknesses? Is it too watered down? And in terms of just the management and administration, they don't offer a lot of tools or support. It's just those tax incentives. They'd love to be able to offer more grants or do statewide marketing for these cultural districts, or technical assistance, bring people together for convenings, but their hands are sort of tied. Another thing that I think is interesting, when I was talking with the director of the program, she was saying that she just encourages people to be as flexible as possible with the actual enacting legislation, and put the policies in the rules and not the law to the extent that you can, because they're in this political climate where they see that changes could be made to benefit the program, but they don't want to tweak the law because they're afraid the whole thing will get axed if they do that. So to the extent, if you do have legislation authorizing it, try to build yourself in as much flexibility as possible out to make changes, outside of the legislative process. I want to talk now about New York City, fourth arts block. I wanted to draw a New York City example because it also has a very strong real estate market, and these issues of affordability are top of everyone's mind. Now, like the city of Providence, New York City has a lot of tools that they apply for the benefit of the arts and cultural sector, but do so primarily outside of cultural district designations. They have 2 officially designated cultural districts, one of which is the 4th Arts Block in the East Village, and it really just is one block. The other official cultural district is the Downtown Brooklyn Cultural District, which is more on the spectrum of the large anchor institution. This is more of the spectrum of the natural occurring cultural district. So the way this came about, it was actually a structure to transfer a bundle of city-owned property to cultural uses. And today, just on this very small block, you'll see 12 theaters, 8 dance and rehearsal studios, a film screening room. The members of the 4th Arts Block range from a volunteer women and transgender collective theater to a nationally renowned theater with a $5 million budget. And the companies have budgets between, most of the companies have budgets between $100,000 and $200,000. Every year they serve over 1,200 artists and draw audiences of over 250,000. But what's interesting about the 4th Arts Block is that it has a very unique history. It was used for art and social activism for over 100 years. In the 20s, it was home to Yiddish theaters, and then union halls, and Italian operettas, and social halls. And this affordable cultural space was passed down from one institution to the next. Now, the facilities did suffer some neglect, and this whole area was slated for demolition under a 1950s era Robert Moses urban renewal scheme. But they actually rallied and had a lot of community activism to prevent this master plan from going into effect. A lot of it was through the Cooper Square Community Association. And what happened was these former tenement buildings in the area got transitioned to community land trusts. So they solved the piece of sort of having the permanent affordable residential space in the neighborhood, but there was still a question of what to do with the cultural spaces. So these arts and cultural groups had been discovering this area, and it had gradually blossomed into this epicenter of avant-garde and culturally specific performing arts for the whole New York region. So here, I just love this one building progression. This is the 1920s when you can see it's being used as a theater. And then here, city ownership, and then finally, after the renovation, where the arts and cultural groups are the owners. And just to give you a little bit of the context, the activism around the 4th Arts Block Cultural District designation happened in the late 90s, early 2000s. Giuliani was the mayor, sort of the end of his administration. A lot of community-owned gardens were being sold for development. There was a prominent former school that was home to lots of arts and cultural organizations Chars that was going to be developed. And there was a great council person, Margarita Lopez, who basically said, not again on my watch. And this, the activism that formed FAB was really driven out of that climate. So they banded together, they decided to call themselves FAB, and eventually formed this nonprofit. And what happened is that the city transferred 8 properties for $8 to the arts and cultural organizations. And there's this management structure where they can use this as a vehicle for capital transfer pass-throughs. So it's hard because each little theater can go and lobby the city government or apply for grants, but having this umbrella organization can help keep the overall vision in mind and help direct, okay, this is the priority. So that entity also does a lot of marketing and just general planning support, streetscaping for the whole region. So I like this example. You might think, hey, this is totally unique. how can you have a block of all of these neglected properties? What can we learn from it? But there are some elements that are replicable, particularly if they're city-owned property. But one thing that I think is interesting is that they insisted on deed restrictions for the property, so both for the transfers of the properties as well as later capital grants for improvements, which I believe the city's now contributed $25 million. So they may have been bad landlords in the past, but they're certainly making good now. So there are deed restrictions so that these properties are permanently going to be held as arts and cultural spaces. And it takes some of the pressure off as a developer of thinking, oh, do they have the capacity? Will they stand the test of time? This is going to be permanently affordable cultural space sort of in the public trust. And I like that it's an example of using a cultural district to support existing and smaller scale arts and cultural activity. My last example is actually Hollywood, California, and it is not an officially designated cultural district, so I'm breaking my rules here, but what it is an 1,100-acre redevelopment zone, and it's anchored by Hollywood Boulevard, managed through the Community Redevelopment Agency of the City of Los Angeles, which is a public authority. It's a quasi-government organization. And Hollywood Boulevard, had fallen upon hard times. It had lost its glamour and was moving more into seediness. And this area that was really anchored by Hollywood Boulevard, they prioritized arts and entertainment and design and sort of that heritage in a lot of the physical rehabilitation work. But what's interesting to me about this example and why I wanted to show it, after they were successful and they were starting to get good infill development, they were sort of a victim of their own success, and it was overheated real estate market. And what you experienced were that these long-time cultural organizations were having trouble staying in the area. And because of the context of this hot real estate market, they were able to have some requirements of developers. So they required the developers to contribute to a percent for art fund. It's 1% of the development costs go to art. And this is just for folks receiving financing from this public authority. So 60% of the funds can be used for on-site public art, and the remaining 40% are pooled into a cultural trust. Or the developers may devote their fee to developing a cultural facility within their project. So I was like, that might be interesting for Seattle. And so here are just some of the examples of the public art that has blossomed. The other thing that I thought was really interesting was that they developed HARP, which stands for the Hollywood Art Retention Project. So it was an intensive technical assistance capacity building program for small arts and cultural organizations to try to help them stay in the area. A partnership with LA Stage Alliance to do this technical assistance training and to help these small arts groups secure long-term leases. So planning support, technical assistance, and seed grants for facility upgrades. So 12 arts groups went through this first pilot program, and then it was repeated and expanded for other areas. So it's just a sort of another, instead of just the supply side, to look at the producers and are there ways in which you can help them survive these tough market climates. So in terms of takeaways, here are some of the tools that we saw used in these different examples. Tax incentives, direct transfer of city-owned properties, tying those to deed restrictions, the capacity training programs, offering technical assistance just in terms of navigating city bureaucracy and being that translator between entities, and present per art requirements for developers, which aren't necessarily for public art, but also could be used for facilities. And then in terms of lessons learned and how we could take away, what the takeaways here are, I hope that I've imparted to you the importance of, context. Sometimes you have these really strong, hot real estate markets, and sometimes it's about trying to spur urban revitalization in this post-industrial city, and you may need a carrot, you may need a stick, depending on what you're dealing with. And if I believe Seattle, I've heard that it might be hard to get any sort of statewide tax incentives on the table for cultural districts. So you have to look at sort of what's possible within your universe. There are some interesting tools to promote affordability in terms of the cultural sector that don't necessarily always translate and equate to cultural districts, right? That sometimes they match up and sometimes they don't. And then the challenges are balancing these tensions, investing in small scale and existing assets versus promoting these large or new anchors. The issues of selectivity and scarcity versus accessibility and equity. Who's in, who's out, where you draw those boundaries. Trying to remain flexible and a little bit opportunistic with the tools versus codifying, formal policy and where that is. But unfortunately, there's a lot more to learn. And with this proliferation of cultural districts, it's really just scratching the surface. And actually, the Americans for the Arts have a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts to try to do an update to their 1998 paper, and they've done a lot of surveying work and will be dedicating a number of their sessions in the next conference just to this topic. So watch out for that. I'm interested to see what they're able to pull in from all of these different programs that have been proliferating across the country.